He looks at things and reads things and he says, this is true, this is false, this is disinformation. And he always sits as a judge in his own case, so he reads articles that are about him. And of course he says that's fake news, that's disinformation. When have you ever heard a politician, in the face of reporting in a newspaper that's critical of them or incriminating of them, ever say, oh yeah, that article is totally true? They always think it's fake news. Certainly one of the 2 or 3 topics on which we have reported and focused most frequently, pretty much since the show began, and I would say since I entered independent journalism in earnest when I left The Intercept and first went to Substack and then came here, is the ongoing attempt to formalize mechanisms to allow governments and other power centers to censor and control the internet. In almost every country in the democratic world, there has been a movement to try and implement legal mechanisms to allow the government to simply censor dissent, to punish dissent, to force big tech companies to censor for them. Even in the United States, where there's, in theory, a First Amendment, the Biden administration got caught coercing and cajoling and threatening big tech over many years to remove all sorts of dissent from the internet that it regarded as threatening, including dissent on COVID, dissent on the war in Ukraine, to the point where many federal judges who looked at it concluded it was a grave threat to the First Amendment and free speech, one of the greatest in decades. And even though the Supreme Court threw the case out on procedural grounds, the substantive findings are still there, and the threat is still there as well. And then there are far worse developments in countries where there's no First Amendment. We've reported often on the new law in the EU called the Digital Services Act that empowers the EU bureaucrats in Brussels to force big tech companies to censor upon the threat of massive fines, percentages of their gross revenue, or even being blocked in various countries. In the UK, which is not part of the EU, they have the Online Safety Act that's intended to do the same. In Canada, there are various laws that are both implemented and still pending to fortify that even more. And then in Brazil, which we've reported on extensively and have been living through to some extent, the censorship scheme has progressed beyond all those others and is now being used as kind of a laboratory to understand how far censorship can go without the public rebelling. And of course, the key is to make sure that you only censor dissidents, people who actually dissent from prevailing establishment ideology. It's never the case, including in the most tyrannical countries, that people who cheer the government, who support the government, who embrace ideological orthodoxies and pieties of those in power, those people are never bothered. They're not the ones imprisoned or censored or punished for dissent because they don't dissent at all. The people who are in danger with these laws are the people who actually want to criticize the government, who want to question its dogmas, who want to offer an alternative way of thinking about things or to disprove the claims that are being made. And the strategy here is, as long as you keep the majority of people in conformity, quiet and quiescent, and you only focus instead on the people who actually pose a threat to your power, the dissent that poses a threat to your power, the bet will be is that most people won't care. In fact, will support the censorship dissent simply by convincing people that dissent itself is a danger, that it's some sort of crime like hate speech or disinformation. You just reclassify it as something that seems menacing enough to warrant punishment. That has been the strategy really since 2016, when you had the dual traumas in the liberal democratic world of Brexit being approved, forcing the UK out of the EU, and then the cataclysmic election of Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. I just actually watched an hour or so of coverage from NBC News last night of the 2016 election, and watching the realization set in that Clinton was going to lose and Trump was going to win, and the way they started confronting that and the genuine trauma that they were experiencing, the emotional turmoil, and that led them to conclude that they could no longer allow people to be free, to speak freely, to hear freely. They had to control the flow of information if they wanted to be able to control the outcomes of nominally democratic elections. And it's been going on, and we've been reporting on the progressive steps that are being taken, and now we're starting to see the full manifestation of it, or at least a much greater manifestation of it than before. Here is the official Twitter account of the global government affairs part of X. They deal with foreign governments, and they are the organ of X that communicates both with and about foreign governments. And they posted the following on Saturday night. Quote, last night, Alexandre de Moraes, which is the censorship judge on the Supreme Court of Brazil, threatened our legal representative in Brazil with arrest if we do not comply with his censorship orders. He did so in a secret order, which we share here to expose his actions. Despite our numerous appeals to the Supreme Court not being heard, the Brazilian public not being informed about these orders, and our Brazilian staff having no responsibility or control over whether content is blocked on our platform, Judge Moraes has chosen to threaten our staff in Brazil rather than respect the law or due process. As a result, to protect the safety of our staff, we have made the decision to close our operation in Brazil effective immediately. The X service remains available to the people of Brazil. We are deeply saddened that we have been forced to make this decision. The responsibility lies solely with Alexandre de Moraes. His actions are incompatible with democratic government. The people of Brazil have a choice to make: democracy or Alexandre de Moraes. And they attached the order in Portuguese that says exactly this. We've been reporting on this for a long time. Remember, Rumble is also not available in Brazil. If I'm in Brazil and I want to watch my own show or look at Rumble, I have to use a VPN to pretend I'm not in Brazil, to trick the platform into believing I'm not in Brazil, just in order to access it, because Rumble decided that the avalanche of censorship orders that they were receiving almost every day to ban not just random extremists, but elected officials of the Brazilian Senate and the Brazilian Congress, and journalists and activists who just simply criticized Alexandre de Moraes, that it wasn't worth it to them. They'd rather remove themselves from the Brazilian market, even though it's a very big and profitable market. And now we're on the verge of having X unavailable in Brazil as well, of X, because of its refusal to censor. And as we've gone over before, these censorship orders are done with no due process. They're done in secret. The people who are targeted with the censorship are not notified. They're not given any explanation. They have no opportunity to contest the banning. It's all done by a single judge with full censorship, unlimited censor powers centralized in his hands. Wednesday night, I talked about the stories that we were publishing. Comes from this massive archive of chats and audios and documents and messages that come right from the heart of the chambers of this Brazilian censorship judge, Alexandre de Moraes. It involves conversations and planning and plotting and actions by his top aides in the various offices he was controlling. We've been able to report on a lot of the wrongdoing that those messages exposed, and we're doing it. I'm working with Folha of São Paulo, which is the country's largest newspaper, and they're doing a very good job of allowing the reporting to go as it should. On Wednesday night, that was the second day of our reporting when I came on here and told you about what was going on. Every single day since then, Thursday, Friday, and again today, we have published new material, new articles, new revelations. And on that very first day, when we published the very first article, and it was clear that there was a 6 gigabyte archive that we had in our hands that came right from his office of secret conversations and the like, he went to the chambers of the Supreme Court and spoke in his defense. A couple members of the Supreme Court also defended him because they've been allowing it to happen. And what he said was so striking after he explained why everything he did was completely justified. And one of his main excuses for why it was justified, we were able to disprove its truth through subsequent publications that came from the archive. But what he said at the end was that this kind of reporting, this reporting that we're doing, is the exact type of disinformation and fake news that Brazil needs to do a lot more to use the criminal law to combat. In fact, this is not just fake news and disinformation. It's designed, he said, to undermine the legitimacy of the state and therefore weaken Brazilian democracy. In other words, if you criticize him in any way, if you question him in any way, let alone defy him, you're basically guilty of some kind of treason. And the reason that is allowed, what enables him to do that is this concept of disinformation, that he and he alone dictates truth. Just sitting by himself, he looks at things and reads things and he says, this is true, this is false, this is disinformation. And he always sits as a judge in his own case, so he reads articles that are about him. And of course he says that's fake news, that's disinformation. When have you ever heard a politician, in the face of reporting in a newspaper that's critical of them or incriminating of them, ever say, oh yeah, that article is totally true? They always think it's fake news or disinformation. And it's fine to say that, but it's a whole other thing entirely when that politician is then armed with the power to punish you criminally for the publication of what they regard as fake news and disinformation. And that is what this entire concoction of disinformation has been intended from the start to do, to arm the state all throughout the democratic world with the power to criminally punish people who express views online that the state, even if those views are legal, regards as harmful or regards as inaccurate or false. And it doesn't even require explanation why the inevitable consequence of that is to shield and immunize them from any further critique, either because people will be afraid to do so because they know what will happen if they do. People in Brazil have seen all kinds of people go, not just get banned from the internet, but go to prison for harshly criticizing this judge in a way that he deems to be excessive or fake news or whatever. It's designed not only to immunize them through scaring people, although that is a major way, but also to those people who aren't scared, you can then punish them. You can silence them, you can remove them from the internet, and you have control now of the only real flow of information that people use to get the news and their impressions about the world and the government, which is the internet. And that is why we spent so much time on this, because this is beyond pernicious, but it is not a case of censorship here, a little excessive reaction here. This is a coordinated legislative scheme. And countries are watching one another, and that's why I say it matters what's going on in Brazil, not just because of the size of the country or its geostrategic importance, but because the more Brazil goes forward, the more the EU goes forward, the more the EU goes forward, the more the UK goes forward, and Canada and the US. It's only one internet. And it's all being censored in the same way. And even though some countries are a little bit behind the others in terms of where they already progressed to, the framework, the underlying principle, the authoritarianism is exactly the same. And if you see other countries that are a little bit ahead of where you are, don't celebrate that, but understand that it's just a question of time before your country and your society gets there.